Jim, let me get another question here. Let's get some serious stuff. Now, we have a lot of questions about the CM Punk, AEW, Elite, all drama wrestling issues. We'll get to them a little bit later. Let's get to some of the other topics and some of the other serious things here early in the show. Jim, this next question, sent to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from Will in Illinois. The Honky Tonk Man said in a shoot interview that Howard Finkel had what he called perhaps the biggest collection of pornographic material in the United States. Was this something commonly known about the Fink? Also, any other people in the business known to possess a copious celluloid compilation collection? Also, any chance this makes a future episode of WWE Most Wanted Treasures?
Track down Finkel's porn. I honestly have never saw Finkel's collection. I have a hard time believing that even 25 years ago it could have rivaled mine, but nevertheless, we'll give him that.
How did word get out? Did he like to come up to guys and just talk like, hey, did you see Cafe Flesh?
No, actually, I mean, I can't sit here with a gun to my head and say that Finkel never referenced a fucking X-rated video to me, because, I mean, who hasn't at various points in their life? What? I'm serious. Who hadn't at some point in their life been talking about, fucking this Vanessa Del Rio flick one time in the 70s or whatever.
In the 70s, yeah.
Or the moderns, I mean, Stan Lane and I were guests in the Vivid Video warehouse in the 80s, and Steve Hirsch would just say, just pull down whatever you want. So one time I had to have them boxed up and shipped back. I couldn't take them all on the plane.
But you're talking about movies, right?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I would have bought them planes.
Pull whatever you want down and take it.
No, the Vivid girls were ticket worthy. You wouldn't have put them on a bus. No, the ones you really liked, you always bought a plane ticket for. But anyway.
We're talking about the late Howard Finkel, yes.
But at some point in any adult's life, they've, talked about or made a joke about an X-rated movie is what I'm saying to you. There was no... At the time that I was working with Finkel, there was no porn on the internet because there wasn't really any fucking internet to speak of. It still looked like fucking Pong graphics when you got on whatever it was back then. But anyway, so I don't know this, and I've not honestly heard this be a large subject about talking about Finkel. I've always heard about his collection of vintage music, and he was a fucking oldies trivia just bulldog. He could bowl you over with oldies music trivia. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that we did most often, because I was the only other one in the office at one point that he could talk to regularly that could compete with him in any appreciable way, and he was still better than me. But nevertheless, I don't know about this giant pornography collection of Howard Finkel's.
Would you imagine that his smut collection is purely videotape, or do you think there'll be a large magazine collection as part of this smut collection?
Well, if it was that large, and this was, gosh, when would Wayne been around? Honky been around him last? The early mid 2000s at best. So,
but how would Honky know too? I mean, it's not like was it like, hey, come over?
They were talking about it.
Come over and take a look. Behind the curtain.
I don't know if he'd asked Finkel, hey, Fink, have you got, thousands of porn magazines and videos? Maybe he said, I don't know how that would have come up, but things come up between adults.
I just wish I had a copy of New Wave Hookers. I have one.
Well, I've got one too. As a matter of fact, no, it's actually... Is it new? Shit, I got to check now. Is it New Wave Hookers or New Wave Hookers Part 2? Because I've got the old VHS tapes came with the full color cardboard boxes, remember? And so they're like, stuff you can put on your shelf and display. It's a very high class porn packaging. And they didn't just have all of the members hanging into the orifices and everything on covers back then. They were more tasteful. They were really artfully done.
Hey, if we could actually seriously discuss porn for a second and how it relates to wrestling and everything that is introduced as a new format to watch content or record content, the early adapters are always, or early adopters, I guess I should say, are always wrestling fans and fans of pornography. What do you think the porn business gets right about marketing or packaging or anything else that wrestling, or at least from your knowledge of the classic porn business, that wrestling gets wrong? Where are they ahead of the game and where are they behind the game in terms of getting their content to a specific audience and kind of avoiding any other form of advertising or anything else?
Well, it's very similar in the early video era. I mean, now, my God, it does. I don't know if there are any major million-selling porn videos today, because everything's free on the internet. And if you go into a porn store, it's just thousands of things. I don't know how they find the people or the time to shoot them. But early on, and we've talked about this, porn was instrumental in a lot of things early on in the home video revolution, including, and some people scoff at this, but VHS being the format that the American porn producers picked heavily weighed the VHS beta fight toward VHS, at least in this country. And in Japan, beta was 10-1 the most popular for quite some time. But maybe the Japanese tentacle monsters, I don't know what their porn industry was like early on. But think about this. When was the first, even with Vince, when were the first commercial wrestling videotapes released? What
85.
Year? Exactly. I had a VCR in late 1979. I know I was way ahead of the crowd because of my fascination with wanting to tape wrestling. But by 1981, 1982, there were tons of Hollywood movies readily available on video, and more people were getting VCRs, and they were coming down in price. And by 83, 84, there were video stores, at least as I remember, about that time frame, except in Louisiana. They were about 20 years behind the times. And wrestling did nothing. And Jerry Jarrett in 1983 was still recording over not only the tapes of the matches that he taped at the Mid-South Coliseum that never made TV and would have been the first thing that I would have minded to do video releases, but he was taping over the goddamn television show still. And so were the other promoters, most of them. Graham saved everything. Vern saved everything. Obviously, Vince and Vince Sr., but, that was few and far between. So wrestling really, porn was one of the first things you could get to stick in your VCR. But wrestling lost out on like 5 years of that, 2 or 3 years that they could have been making money, and 4 or 5 years to compete with porn. I know more people like fucking than wrestling, but still, the point is that the wrestling promotions were all, even Vince was all late to doing anything on home video. And then the first home video was not a WWF project. It was the PW Insider tape they did, right?
That's
Lords
right.
of the Ring.
Yeah, Jeff Otto. I wanted to ask you about something, though, and you're right. And I actually have, I was able to get all of the original run of VHS, WWF, and Coliseum Home Video, and then those things, like Lords of the Ring, and then there were those videos that came out with Mid-Atlantic squash matches. I mean, there's all sorts of weird early video releases. But if we're going back to when you first got VHS, let's say 1980. 1980, there was porn available on video, correct?
Correct.
Wrestling, when Vince McMahon gets his deal with Coliseum in 85, he's going national. So if him or anyone else did something in 1980, it was still a territory system. Now, maybe you can make a deal. It's not crazy to think at that point you could still make a deal. Hey, I'm doing this video thing. If we include you, we can make some money. Let's split it, advertise it on your show. You never know. But if one of the promoters actually wanted to do that and release wrestling content in 1980 or 1981 commercially on VHS, obviously the price was sky high at that point, but because it wasn't national yet, would it have sold and where? Who could have done it? Who would have had an audience that would have been able to purchase it or would have purchased it yet?
Well, here's the thing. In 1980, maybe nobody, because there were so few people with VCRs. But as it started to grow exponentially, you mentioned the price was ridiculous. And not only for 2-hour porn video, VHS videos, but also Hollywood videos, any major motion picture release, whatever. A 2-hour VHS to buy it in those days, early 80s, was literally between $79 and $99.
Yeah,
right?
when I was a kid, my friend's dad got a Return of the Jedi VHS, and I think it was $89 at that point.
Yeah. And that lasted for a couple of years until people started figuring out that they could buy more than one VCR and make copies of things. And then they came up with Copy Guard, where you couldn't copy a VHS tape onto another VCR because the signal was somehow scrambled. But then they came up with a Copy Guard eliminator. It was like the Fuzzbuster, right? And I had all this shit. But the point is, if you were taping off television, it was free. And if you bought 2 VCRs, then what it cost you to make a copy tape was whatever the blank tape cost. And we talked about this, the 79 and 80, you had to go to the mall and they were $25 a piece, but then you could order from New York and get a case of 10 and it got down to $12 or whatever. Point I'm making is wrestling has always been a business that figured out a way to do shit on a shoestring. And in hindsight now, yes, the major movie releases and the porn was $89 because there was duplication, and then there was fucking packaging, and then there was goddamn, probably all kinds of fees had to be paid between the studio and the production, whatever, and then you got to retail a thing in stores. But I know for a fact you can do this because we were doing it in Ohio Valley Wrestling in fucking 2001. Danny Davis bought 50 or 100, I can't remember how many he had at one point in time hooked up, cheap at the time VCRs that were down to $99, and had them wired up where they were all slaves to one master unit, and he could make multiple copies of our TV tapings on VHS in an hour, right? Run it once and you got 50 or 75 or however many he had wired up copies. You can't tell me that Vince McMahon and or actually Vern Gagne, because think of his geographic territory and the big cities he had, or even the Von Erichs in 1983, as hot as they were, if one of those wrestling promotions had said, hey, wrestling fans, here's a 2-hour tape of your favorite wrestlers in these main event matches in the Philadelphia Spectrum or Madison Square Garden or Reunion Arena in Dallas or the St. Paul Civic Center, wherever it may be, 2 hours of this for $39.99, and they buy 100 VCRs and they got them, and they get a fucking price on 1,000 tapes. How many just on commercials on their programs in New York and Philly and Boston or Dallas, Texas or Chicago or Minneapolis, major cities, you would have sold thousands because it was novel and brand new. And it would have been targeted specifically to those territories' audiences. But the promoters did not understand. And to be honest, when I got into business, I figured out why. Because at that time, almost no wrestlers had VCRs because they never watched television to begin with. They were gone from 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning every day of the week in a car. And and Danny Davis, my partner in OVW, was an early example of a wrestler that got a VCR specifically to tape the shows, his matches, and the shows that he was on. And we ended up trading back and forth because the Jackson show had the Memphis Coliseum matches. So he'd tape his at home and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of the guys They just, and the promoters especially, they didn't realize what was going on. This was they thought nobody's going to actually want to do this in any large numbers, have VCRs and tape shit in their house. So they lost several years there at the front when they could have capitalized.
How do you think it would have done? In 1983, if Memphis had put out something at the height of the Fabulous Ones, or 82, 83, and also in 86, if Crockett had been better prepared with, let's say there were 3 VHS releases that year that you could have sold at shows, would they have sold? Was there enough of the audience that had a VCR?
Well, by 1986,
yeah,
my God, yes. There were people that had VCRs. And also, that was when, for example, Starcade, 86, right? They went through Turner Home Entertainment to release that. So it wasn't a do-it-yourself type of thing like I'm talking about. They actually would have come out better that way. But the Starcade 86 tape through Turner Home Entertainment was the first wrestling video, and I was told this by people from Turner Home Entertainment. So it wasn't like there's, that fucking Vince, they don't fucking know. Said this is the first wrestling video to go gold. And Vince had done a few at that point. That was our first one. And that's why, we were supposed to get royalties. And for about a year and a half, every couple of weeks, I'd knock on Jimmy Crockett's door after promos at the office and say, Jimmy, heard anything on those royalties yet? Nope, we'll let you know. And then finally, by the time we signed that new contract in spring of 88 for that ridiculous guaranteed money, I just said, fuck it, we'll just stop asking. So we never got, because he got in, by the time that they started getting the checks on that, that's when he'd got in trouble. We never got any royalties on that fucking tape. But it's $1 million in those days was what? Or has it changed? 50,000 units?
I'm not sure how many units. I can look it up. But again, that would have not been on sale until 1987. We're
87,
talking about
right.
A little bit before that.
Yeah, well, and that's what I'm saying. When the as hot as the Rock and Roll Express were, as hot as Dusty and Magnum were, the Road Warriors or whatever, if Crockett had just done a compilation tape and sold it through mail order, through spots on his televisions only where he already had commercial time, the Rock and Roll Express fan club generated 7 figures. And like, what was it, $19.99 a piece? You got a life-size poster, a fan club bulletin, the Boogie Woogie Dance Hall 45 RPM single, and everybody's best wishes for that fan club. And they generated over $1 million at $19.99 a piece.
I understand Ricky and Robert got about, 35 cents per member, correct?
Well, I don't know. I heard they got about 20 grand a piece on either one for everything. So it generated 7 figures and they got about 20 grand a piece. I don't know what that breaks down to per member, and see, that's something, if they'd applied themselves, that Crockett already was set up to do and he didn't realize it. He'd set up the concept. The way that they duplicated their television shows. And this is primitive as fuck, but remember, this is 40 years ago. And it actually is a way that, small budget promotions operated like this in-house up until the time territories went away, and OVW did after that. Let's say we go to Gaffney, South Carolina on a Tuesday night, and we do the syndicated television taping at the college gym there in Gaffney. It's 60 miles from Charlotte, so it's about an hour drive. They own their own television truck, the Nemo truck, National Electronics Mobile Operation. They drive the truck an hour down to one of these high school or college gyms around Charlotte. They set up the lights, they wire everything, they run the cables, they shoot 2 hours of television, NWA Worldwide and NWA Pro. And that goes from 7:30 to 10 o'clock. And each show they roll live to tape. And, if they're going to put a VTR in, they roll it in the truck. They leave black holes for the commercial spots and for the local promos. Then they drive the truck back to fucking Charlotte. And they park it back behind the office at Briarbend. And they take the 2 master tapes in. And remember old Leonard, the guy that did the night work there that alerted me that they were throwing away the entire film archive of Mid-Atlantic Wrestling when Turner Broadcasting took over and bought everything. Leonard would put the daggum tapes on, and I don't know how many they could make at the same time, and this was the old 1-inch video reels, right? So you can imagine you got to fucking unroll those and put them on the spool and fucking zabada and get them all synced up and everything. And then he would hit the button and they would make multiple duplicates of that master tape at one time. And then he'd do nothing all night, but just run them back and copy the tapes over and over. However many they could make at a time, times however many. Because Wednesday morning, about 9 o'clock, Gene Anderson would be in there with Jackie Crockett on camera, and all the top babyface and heels would come in and do local promos from 9 o'clock in the morning until 3, 4 o'clock sometimes. And then you'd immediately hop in the car and drive 3 hours to Raleigh or go to the airport to fly it somewhere, whatever the fuck. But what they would do, honest to God, is they would sync the tape for, let's say, Philadelphia. We got local promos to do for Philadelphia because we got a show coming up at the Civic Center. So whatever tape was going to the TV station in Philadelphia, they would reel it up to the exact point of the babyface interview segment that needed to be inserted. And we'd record those goddamn interviews on the tape that was actually going to the TV station. And as soon as we did that interview, then they'd jump ahead to the fucking heel segment in between segs 5 and 6 or whatever. And they'd do the 2-minute and 28-second interview for there. The interviews were 2:28 because they left a second to get in and a second to get out. Elsewise, they're rolling over fucking program, right? Once that the Philly interviews were done, that tape was done, they'd stick it back in the case, put a label on it. And whether Klondike Bill or Bunk Harris, whoever the fuck that day wasn't going to get chicken at Price's Chicken Coop for lunch, they would take the tapes to the bus station and put them on a bus to the television station in the city that was going to air it that weekend. So it went out on Wednesday evening and it got there on Thursday because back then, Brian, what year did Federal Express start?
Oh, I'm not sure. I couldn't tell you.
I bet you there was no Federal Express in 1986, if you want to look it up while I'm rambling.
86? I would think there was. Hold on, let me check.
Oh, well, just see. But the point is, they had been doing that. A lot of promotions did it. They would put posters and flyers for sponsors in small towns. They'd put them on a bus in those days. They'd put the TV tape on a bus. The only reason they didn't do that in Louisville is because Teenie came up here every week. She'd have the tape in the trunk of her car. And she would exchange, she'd get last week's and give them next week's.
FedEx, which we used to call Federal Express,
right,
started in 1971.
71? I don't believe it. I never heard of them. All right, when did express mail from the post office start?
Jesus Christ. Hold on. I'll be right back.
Well, anyway, and they used to have a thing also called Delta Dash, where before these overnight services were just common in every city in America, like if Flair forgot his belt or something was needed from the home base for a pay-per-view or earlier than that for a TV taping or whatever the case, there's been many times that the NWA belt would be Delta dashed to a location, meaning somebody where the belt was. And they did this in TNA too, even 20 years ago. Somebody left the belt, but wherever the belt was, they would take it and put it in a box and take it to the airport, and they would put it on a Delta plane. And back then, 40 years ago, the plane tickets cost basically the same thing they do now. Plane tickets, for whatever reason, haven't gotten appreciably more expensive, probably because it's more miserable to travel. But you could Delta dash something for like $99 and it would go on a plane and somebody had to pick it up at baggage claim at the other end. And sometimes every once in a while in an emergency, a TV tape would go that route also. But nevertheless,
an update here. Special delivery was transformed into express mail in 1977, and priority mail started in 1968.
I would not have thought those things were that old. But nevertheless, that's what they would do, is they would roll these interviews into the actual tape that was going to the TV station that weekend. There was no post-production per se in terms of, okay, we're going to shoot all these interviews and we're going to slate them and then we're going to go back and insert them into blah, blah, blah. No, that's another reason why the local interviews for most territories, and even Crockett's, as big as he was, they don't exist anywhere else except in tapes of the television program that aired in that specific market. So when you see these local promos with Tony Schiavone and the orange background or sometimes the blue background they had, and the Chiron, tonight Charlotte, tonight Greenville or Chicago, whatever the case, from Crockett Promotions, that has to be off the actual air broadcast of that television program that weekend because they didn't exist anywhere else. But what were we talking about?
We were talking about Howard Finkel and his love of pornography.
Howard Finkel and his love of pornography led us to a 30-minute dissertation on video and wrestling. But yes, so that's the point I was going to make, thankfully, now that I've beat around the bush and remembered it. Crockett was already doing a mass duplication, in effect, of his in-house of his TV programs. If he'd applied the same thing to putting together a home video and just bought the VCRs and done everything there at the office himself, there were thousands of people in these buildings every night. If they just sold 25 tapes that they made $20 on every night, right? There's $500 times 7 nights a week is $3,500 times sometimes 2 shows per night most of the time. There would be so, and then every week. And that's if you sold 20. What do you think in Greensboro? There's 8 or 10,000 people in the Coliseum, and here's the best of the Road Warriors for $29.95. How many of them you think they would have sold when there was no other wrestling tapes on the market to compete with it in stores at that time? And if you got wrestling tapes, you had to get them from people that actually fucking traded them to you.
If when the Rock and Roll Express first came in 85, if there had been a compilation video and probably half hour at the most, and again, sold at a competitive price for the time, were there enough girls that would pay that money to get it?
Good God. The $19.99 fan club grossed over $1 million. So if you could have just taken a video of Robert Gibson's dick and sold it for $50, you'd have had a gold fucking release just from the girls in the Carolinas. As a matter of fact, just sell one to every girl in the Carolinas that had seen Robert Gibson's dick, and it would have gone gold.
I'd like to say hello to the Gibson family if they're listening today in Pensacola. Happy that.
Or Pepsi Cola. This girl that used to send me clippings and results from Knoxville back in the mid-70s. She loved the Gibson brothers, right? And then they left the territory, and it was announced on TV that, gone back home or whatever. She wrote me, said, yeah, they've gone back to Pepsi Cola, Florida.
Well,
it was right down the road from RC County and Orange Knee High Way.
RC Cola is the most disgusting shit ever. But listen, you're laughing about this whole ordeal. You're laughing about this whole ordeal. But this young woman obviously missed her Gibson brothers. And perhaps out of that loss, she needed someone to speak to. If she was a listener of this program way back in the mid-70s, she would know that there was someone that she could speak to.
If she was listening to this program in the mid-70s, she had a time machine because this format was not created. And Actually, you were only a gleam in your father's eye at that point, as Mother Cornette used to say. But I'll tell you what, here's the problem, Brian. Here is the problem. A lot of people, and this goes for the wrestling business and it goes for everybody personally out there. A lot of people get stuck focusing on problems instead of solutions. How can we correct this situation? How might it go better with a different outlook or a different approach? Or what can we do to be proactive to make this thing better, alleviate whatever crisis it may be? There's a lot of people out there dwelling on problems, not a lot of solution dwellers out there. And that's, one of our sponsors for so long has been the folks at BetterHelp. And they're experts in communicating and communication. And it can be tough to train your brain to stay in the problem-solving mode when you're the one that the avalanche is coming down off the top of the mountain. It's landing on you. So therefore, sometimes you need to talk to somebody, bounce some ideas off someone, or have them suggest things that may make your situation better. That's what therapy is. And that's why so many people have benefited from talking to somebody at BetterHelp. They unload their stress and kind of heal emotionally. They get help with anxiety and depression from somebody else's outlook that may be focused on a way to make things better instead of the things that are going wrong. As a matter of fact, now that I've said all those things, I think we ought to, you and I, Brian, go in 50-50 on a subscription for all the folks in AEW for BetterHelp. But in the meantime, for the Cult of Cornette listeners out there, if you're thinking about giving therapy a try...
Why do we have to pay for that?
Well, now that I'm thinking about it, we should still be charitable to the folks at AEW because they're not long for this world, heaven's sake. Anyway, the folks at BetterHelp are convenient, accessible, affordable, and the whole thing is conducted entirely online, so no messy going out in an uncertain world and potentially contagious diseases flitting around about out there. You don't have to mess with any of that. You can get matched with a therapist after filling out a brief survey, and you can switch therapists anytime you like. So if you want to be a better problem solver, therapy can get you there, and the fine folks at BetterHelp.com/JCE can help facilitate that. And if you go there right now, you'll get 10% off your first month's services. BetterHelp, HELP.com/JCE. Solve the problems. Don't dwell on them. Solve them. Tap dance on them. Do a Tennessee two-step on those problems. Those problems will not know what hit them.